She was rejected for being pregnant, cast aside like yesterday's newspaper by those who once claimed to love her. But when all seemed lost, the mountain man stepped forward with fire in his eyes and conviction in his voice. "That's my child too," he declared, silencing the room with words that would forever change the course of their lives. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Summer Solstice Festival in Ember Glen was a tapestry of light and sound. Garlands of wildflowers hung from every eave, and the scent of pine smoke mingled with honeyed mead as villagers danced around towering bonfires. Children darted between adults with sparklers, their laughter rising above the fiddles and drums that set the rhythm of the celebration. Alina stood at the edge of the square, her fingers nervously twisting the embroidered sleeve of her festival dress. She had managed to conceal her condition for months, but the fitted ceremonial attire revealed what loose, everyday clothes had hidden. Her rounded belly caught the firelight as she stepped forward to join the traditional circle dance. The music faltered when Nevin, her suitor of 2 seasons, noticed. His face transformed from joy to horror in an instant. "You're with child?" he demanded, loud enough for nearby dancers to hear. The circle broke apart as he backed away from her, hands raised as if to ward off something unclean. "I was going to tell you," Alina whispered, but her words were drowned by the rising murmurs. The villagers formed a half-circle around her, their faces hardening with judgment. Someone spat on the ground. An elder woman made a sign to ward off misfortune. Derek stepped forward, his elder staff striking the cobblestones with finality. "Who is responsible for this?" he demanded, voice cutting through the whispers. The rigid elder's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the crowd, searching for a guilty face. Alina's chin trembled as she stood alone in the harsh light of the bonfire. Tears threatened, but she fought them back, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Then a gravelly voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's my child too." The square fell into stunned silence. Villagers parted as Bram Calder stepped from the shadows into the firelight. The mountain man's presence was as startling as his words. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard that hadn't seen scissors in years, he was a figure most knew only by reputation or glimpsed from afar on the mountainside. "Bram Calder," Old Wino whispered, loud enough for all to hear. The storyteller's eyes widened as if witnessing the fulfillment of some ancient tale. "The Raven's child returns at solstice." Torvin the blacksmith pushed forward, his ambitious eyes calculating. "What game are you playing, mountain man? You haven't set foot in the village square for 3 harvests." Bram ignored him, his gaze fixed solely on Alina, whose face reflected confusion equal to the crowd's. His claim hung in the air, ambiguous and bold, neither confirming paternity nor denying it. "The elders will speak on this," Derek announced, his authority visibly shaken by this unexpected turn. But around the edges of the gathering, whispers had already begun, whispers of prophecy, scandal, and secrets long buried in Ember Glen. Whispers slithered through Ember Glen like morning mist, seeping under doorways and through shuttered windows. By midnight, every household buzzed with speculation about Alina and the reclusive mountain man's shocking claim. Women clutched their shawls tighter as they shared theories across garden fences, while men muttered darkly over tankards at the village square. Alina woke before dawn, her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of 100 stairs had crushed her during yesterday's festival, and now dread settled in her stomach alongside the child growing within. She had seen what happened to Marta 3 summers ago, banished with nothing but a sack of provisions and the clothes on her back. The memory of Marta's pleading eyes haunted her as she hastily gathered her few belongings. The eastern sky had barely lightened when she slipped through the sleeping village, past the elders' meeting place, where her fate would soon be decided. Each step up the mountain path felt like both escape and exile. The climb left her winded, her hand instinctively cradling her swollen belly as she paused to catch her breath. Bram Calder's lodge appeared through the morning mist, like a fortress of timber and stone. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting he was already awake. She hesitated at the threshold, knuckles poised to knock, suddenly questioning her decision. But where else could she go? The door swung open before she could knock. Bran stood there, tall and imposing, his weathered face unreadable. "I knew you'd come," he said simply, stepping aside to let her enter. The interior was sparse, but unexpectedly clean. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with earthy scents. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across wooden walls adorned with simple tools and carved trinkets. "Why did you say it?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why claim my child as yours, when we both know it isn't true?" The mountain man moved to the hearth, stoking the fire without meeting her gaze. The village has its ways, old ways, cruel ways sometimes. "That doesn't answer my question." Bram's jaw tightened. "You'll have shelter here, food, protection. That's what matters now." She studied his profile, searching for deception, but finding only rigid determination. "I don't understand you." "You don't need to understand," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "Just know you're safe here." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken histories. Alina settled onto a rough-hewn bench, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The distance between them felt vast despite the cabin's modest size, a gulf of secrets and uncertainty that neither seemed ready to bridge. Outside, a raven called, its harsh cry echoing across the mountainside. Inside, two strangers, bound by a false claim and very real consequences, contemplated the long seasons ahead. Autumn swept into Ember Glen with a vengeance. For 3 days and nights, rain hammered the valley without mercy, transforming the gentle streams into roaring torrents. By the 4th morning, the villagers emerged from their homes to discover the trade road, their only connection to neighboring settlements, had collapsed into a muddy ravine. "We have 6 weeks of flour at most," Derek announced grimly as the elders gathered in the square. The old man's weathered face creased with worry as he surveyed the anxious crowd. "And winter will be upon us before the road can be rebuilt." Sarah stepped forward, her herb pouch swinging at her side. "What about the mountain paths? Surely there must be another way to reach the trading post." A heavy silence fell as every gaze shifted toward the northern ridge where Bram Calder's lodge stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky. No one had ventured there since Alina's flight after the solstice festival. The mountain man's claim over her unborn child still hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to ignore. "I'll speak with him," the herbalist volunteered, already turning toward the path that wound up the mountainside. But Torvin pushed through the crowd, the blacksmith's powerful frame commanding attention. "Why should we trust him now?" he demanded, voice carrying across the square. "He hides away for years, then suddenly claims a child and expects us to believe his word?" Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Torvin seized the moment, moving closer to Derek. "Perhaps this is exactly what he wanted, to force us into dependence. First the girl, now our survival." Old Wyna clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "The mountain has always provided for those who respect it," the storyteller reminded them. "Just as Bram has provided herbs for our births these many years." "Herbs we never asked for," Torvin countered. "Just as we never asked him to shame us with his interference." Nevertheless, necessity overcame suspicion. By nightfall, a delegation including Sarah and 3 village men climbed the rain-slick path to Bram's door. They returned before dawn with the reclusive man himself, his face impassive as he outlined 3 hidden trails that could safely bypass the washed-out road. "I'll guide the first group tomorrow," he stated simply. As Bram led the initial supply party across treacherous slopes and hidden valleys, Torvin remained behind, his whisper seeding doubt among those who waited. The blacksmith's ambition found fertile ground in their fear and uncertainty. He knows these paths because he's always stood apart. Corvin told anyone who would listen. What man chooses solitude unless he has something to hide? By the time Bram returned with vital supplies, the village had fractured into those grateful for his help and those who questioned his every motive. A division as deep as the ravine that had swallowed their road. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Bram Calder's mountain lodge as Sarah made her way carefully up the muddy path. Her basket of herbs was protected under a waxed cloth, precious cargo that had already earned her sideways glances in the village. The herbalist paused at the threshold, rain dripping from her cloak, before Bram's gruff voice invited her inside. "You shouldn't have come," he said, taking her soaked outer garment. "They'll talk." Sarah smiled faintly. "They already talk, Bram. What's one more rumor to add to their collection?" The interior of the lodge was warmer than she expected. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Alina sat nearby, her hands resting protectively over her growing belly. The young woman's eyes brightened at the sight of the herbalist. "I've brought raspberry leaf for tea," Sarah explained, unpacking her basket on the rough-hewn table. "And nettle for strength. Your body needs nourishment now more than ever." Bram watched from the corner, arms folded across his chest. "Will it be enough? The winter's coming fast." "It will help," the herbalist replied, hanging bundles of herbs from the rafters. Soon, the scent of resin smoke mingled with the earthy fragrance of drying plants, transforming the mountain man's austere dwelling into something more hospitable. As Alina rested, Sarah pulled Bram aside. "The village elders are restless. Darek speaks of ancient customs, of banishment for those who break tradition." "Let them try," he growled, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand," she insisted, lowering her voice. "They won't seek to understand what you've done or why. They'll only see a threat to their authority." The mountain man turned away, but not before Sarah caught the flash of pain in his eyes. "I know their ways better than you think." Together they worked through the afternoon, Sarah teaching Bram how to prepare the remedies Alina would need in the coming months. Their hands moved in an awkward dance, the gentle healer and the calloused mountain dweller finding common purpose. "She needs more than herbs," Sarah said finally, watching Alina sleep. "She needs hope, connection." "The child grows, but her spirit withers under this isolation." Bram nodded slowly. "I can protect her body, but the heart needs its own medicine," the herbalist finished. "We must find a way to give her that too." As twilight fell, Sarah gathered her empty basket. "I'll return in 3 days. Steep the nettle overnight, not just at morning." The mountain man walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. Sarah pulled her hood up against the rain. "This alliance of ours, it's for her sake. Remember that when the village turns against you both." Winter arrived with a vengeance, earlier than anyone in Ember Glen could remember. The first snowfall came silently overnight, transforming the village into a pristine white landscape that glittered under the pale morning sun. Within days, the gentle dusting had become a thick blanket that muffled sounds and slowed life to a crawl. Alina stood at the window of Bram's mountain lodge, her hand resting on her growing belly as she watched dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "There's more coming," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Bram Calder nodded grimly, adding another log to the hearth. "The animals have been warning of it for weeks. This will be a harsh one." When the blizzard struck, it came with a fury that seemed almost personal. Howling winds bent the pines nearly double, and snow piled against the walls of the lodge until the windows were half buried. The storm had caught several villagers unaware on their way to check their winter traps. 3 men and 2 women, who now huddled uncomfortably in Bram's home, eyeing their reluctant host with suspicion. "We should have turned back sooner," muttered one of the men, rubbing his frost-nipped hands near the fire. His gaze darted between Alina and the mountain man, disapproval evident in the tight line of his mouth. Sarah moved quietly among them, offering herbal tea to warm their cores. "The mountain gives no warning sometimes," the herbalist said gently. "We're fortunate Bram opened his door to us." The cramped quarters grew more tense as day turned to night, and the storm showed no signs of abating. One of the women whispered to another, their eyes fixed on Alina's rounded figure. The pregnant woman turned away, cheeks flushing with shame. Old Wina, who had arrived just before the worst of the weather, sat nearest the fire, her weathered hands working yarn as she told stories to pass the time. When a loud thump sounded on the roof, everyone startled. "Just a raven," Bram explained, his voice low. "It's been coming around for weeks." Wina's gnarled fingers paused in their work. "Not just any raven," the storyteller said, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "In the old tales, a raven that stays through storms is a messenger between worlds. It marks this place as touched by fate." The villagers shifted uncomfortably, superstition adding another layer to their unease. One man spat into the fire. "More mountain nonsense." "Perhaps," Wina continued undeterred, "or perhaps it watches over what grows here." Her knowing gaze settled briefly on Alina's belly. As the night deepened and the wind screamed around them, secrets began to surface in whispered conversations. Old grievances and fresh suspicions mingled with the smoke from the hearth, filling the lodge with an atmosphere as charged as the storm outside. Through it all, the raven remained, its dark form occasionally visible through the snow-crusted window, a silent witness to the human drama unfolding beneath the mountain's protective embrace. The first warm winds of spring had barely begun to melt the snow when Torvin seized his opportunity. The blacksmith had spent the winter stoking more than just his forge. He had carefully fanned the flames of discontent among the villagers of Ember Glen. As the village square thawed and dried enough for gathering, Torvin called for a meeting. His voice carried across the muddy expanse, drawing curious onlookers from their winter-weary homes. Standing tall, his broad shoulders squared beneath his leather apron, he waited until nearly everyone had assembled. "Bram Calder!" he shouted toward the mountain man who stood at the edge of the crowd, Alina half hidden behind his protective stance. "The time for secrets has passed. You sheltered this woman through winter, claiming her child as your own, yet offering no proof or explanation." The gathered villagers murmured, eyes darting between the imposing mountain dweller and the ambitious craftsman. Sira stood nearby, her gentle features tight with concern as she moved closer to Alina. "Our traditions are clear," Torvin continued, gesturing dramatically toward Derek, who nodded with stern approval. "A child born without proper bonds brings misfortune to us all. You mock our ways with your sudden claim of responsibility." Bram stepped forward, his weathered face revealing nothing of the storm within. "I've given my word," he said simply, his voice low but carrying across the hushed square. "That should be enough." "Words are wind," Torvin spat back. "If you cannot explain how this child came to be yours, then you perpetuate a lie that endangers our village. The girl must be banished before planting season, as tradition demands." Several villagers nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable. Old Wina, leaning heavily on her walking stick, watched the confrontation with knowing eyes, but remained silent. "I will not explain what isn't mine to tell," Bram replied, his jaw set firmly. "But I stand by my claim and my protection. The child will have a father." Orvin circled closer, the smell of smoke and metal clinging to him. "Then you admit there is something to hide? Perhaps you take advantage of her shame for reasons of your own?" A dangerous silence fell as Bram's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, it seemed he might strike the blacksmith, but instead he turned to face the gathered crowd. "Judge me as you will," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion behind it. But remember who has guided you through mountain passes when the trade road washed away. Remember whose knowledge kept your children fed when the snows came early. With that, he turned and walked away, Alina following close behind. The confrontation had ended without resolution, leaving the village divided and uncertain. Some whispered that Torvin spoke truth, while others recalled Bram's quiet acts of assistance through the harsh winter. As they disappeared up the mountain path, Torvin smiled thinly. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Now he would watch them grow. The first green shoots of spring emerged from beneath the melting snow, bringing with them the promise of new beginnings. Yet as the villagers of Ember Glen tilled their fields, anxiety replaced their usual optimism. The soil crumbled between their fingers, dry, rocky, and depleted after years of continuous planting. "Nothing will grow here," Derek announced grimly, standing in the village square with soil samples displayed for all to see. "The earth has turned against us." Following ancient custom, the women gathered at dawn in the barren fields, forming a circle as they began the traditional planting songs. Their voices rose in harmony, a ritual believed to coax fertility from the reluctant ground. When Alina approached the edge of the gathering, her swollen belly now impossible to hide, the singing faltered. "Not her," someone whispered. "Her presence will only bring more misfortune." Sarah stepped forward, attempting to guide Alina into the circle. "Every voice matters in the planting songs." "Not the voice of one who brings shame," countered an elder woman, her words sharp as flint. "The fields fail because we've already broken too many traditions." Alina retreated, tears stinging her eyes as she watched from a distance. The women resumed their singing, but the melody seemed hollow now, fractured by division. That evening, Bram Calder sat silently by his hearth, listening as Alina recounted the day's rejection. The mountain man's weathered face revealed little, but his hands clenched and unclenched around a wooden charm. "There's another way," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "I know places where the soil still remembers how to give." Before dawn the next morning, Bram led a reluctant Sarah, Alina, and 3 other women up a hidden mountain path. After an hour's climb, they emerged onto a series of terraced fields, invisible from the valley below. Dark, rich soil filled these ancient platforms, protected from erosion by stone walls. "My grandfather built these," he explained, kneeling to scoop up a handful of earth. "The village has forgotten them." The women stood in awe as Bram demonstrated how the terraces caught both sunlight and rainwater. He produced a leather pouch of seeds, varieties more hardy than those the village had been stubbornly planting. "Sing here," he urged them. "Plant here." Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, the women began their planting songs. This time, Alina's voice joined them, her hand resting protectively over her child as she pressed seeds into the welcoming earth. When they returned to Ember Glen that evening, soil under their fingernails and hope in their hearts, they carried with them not just the promise of food, but something far more precious, the first fragile seedling of change. The morning light filtered through the small, grimy windows of Bram Calder's lodge as Alina swept the wooden floor. Her pregnancy made bending difficult, but she insisted on contributing to the household that had given her shelter. The mountain air felt cleaner up here, away from the judgmental whispers of Ember Glen. While organizing a shelf of Bram's belongings, her fingers brushed against something tucked behind jars of dried herbs. Curious, she pulled out a small wooden box. Inside lay several intricately carved wooden charms, birds, trees, and stars, connected by flowing patterns. Alina gasped, her hands trembling as she lifted one to the light. "These are my mother's work," she whispered to the empty room. The distinctive swirling pattern around the edges was unmistakable. Her mother had carved similar charms before her passing years ago. Each groove and curve was familiar, like encountering a ghost. Why would the reclusive mountain man possess such intimate connections to her family? Alina turned the charm over in her palm, memories flooding back of her mother's hands working the wood by candlelight, humming old songs as she carved. The sound of Bram's heavy footsteps outside sent her scrambling to return the box, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. When he entered with an armful of firewood, she stood holding the evidence. "These were my mother's," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "How do you have them?" The mountain man froze, his weathered face impossible to read. He set down the wood without answering and turned away, busying himself with the fire. "Bram," she pressed, "please tell me." His shoulders tensed. "Not today," he muttered. Determined to understand, Alina explored further while he chopped wood outside. In the far corner of the lodge, beneath old blankets and tools, she discovered something larger. A cradle, dusty with disuse, but beautifully crafted. Running her fingers along its edge, she found the same distinctive carvings that matched the charms. When Sarah arrived later with fresh herbs, Alina showed her the discovery. The gentle herbalist examined the cradle with knowing eyes. "There are stories about Bram's sister," she whispered. "She left the village before my time. Some say she was with child." The pieces began to align in Alina's mind. Bram's sudden claim at the festival, his determined protection, the hidden cradle. The mountain man carried more than solitude in his heart. He carried a history that somehow intertwined with her own. That night, as they sat in silence by the fire, Alina placed the smallest charm on the table between them. An invitation, not an accusation. The secret hung in the air, waiting for its moment to be spoken. Derek paced the worn floor of the elders' meeting place, his weathered hands clasped tightly behind his back. The flickering light from the hearth cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines of worry etched there over decades of leadership. For 3 generations, he had upheld the traditions that kept Ember Glen whole. Now a pregnant woman and a mountain recluse threatened everything. "This cannot stand," he muttered to himself. "If we bend for her, what becomes of our ways?" A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Torvin entered, his blacksmith's frame filling the doorway, the scent of forge smoke clinging to his clothes. "You wanted to see me, Elder?" The craftsman's voice carried a note of practiced deference that barely masked his ambition. Derek gestured toward a wooden bench. "Sit. What I'm about to propose stays between us." The elder stared into the flames, choosing his words carefully. "Bram Calder has overstepped. By claiming Alina's child, he challenges our authority to uphold the old ways." Torvin leaned forward, firelight glinting in his eyes. "Many in the village agree. They whisper that you've grown soft." The barb struck its mark. Derek's jaw tightened. "I've upheld our traditions for 30 years, but this situation requires delicate handling." "What are you suggesting?" Torvin asked, though his eager expression revealed he already anticipated the answer. "A bargain." Derek turned to face him fully. "If Alina is not properly banished by spring's end, as our customs demand, you'll have my blessing to challenge Bran's position, publicly, with the full weight of tradition behind you." The blacksmith's lips curved into a smile. "And what of his knowledge of the mountain paths? The village relies on him now." "Knowledge can be extracted before judgment is passed," Derek replied coldly. "The village survived before Bram Calder. It will survive after." Torvin stood, extending his hand. "Then we have an agreement." As they clasped hands, Derek felt a flicker of doubt. Was he preserving tradition, or merely his own authority? He pushed the thought away. "Remember," the elder cautioned, "patience serves us. Let the villagers see Bran's defiance for what it is, a threat to our very way of life." Torvin nodded, already calculating his next moves. "I'll make sure they understand what's at stake. The whispers have already begun." After the blacksmith departed, Derek remained by the fire, the weight of his decision settling around his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of Alina's laughter from Bram's mountain lodge. The elder closed his eyes. hardening his heart against compassion. This alliance, forged in firelight and ambition, would either preserve Ember Glen's traditions or tear the village apart at its foundations. The winter hearth ritual descended upon Ember Glen like a cherished blanket, wrapping the village in tradition as old as the mountains themselves. Families opened their doors to neighbors, sharing stews simmered over crackling fires and stories that warmed even more than the flames. Yet, as villagers moved from home to home in celebration, an uncomfortable question hung in the air like wood smoke. Would Alina be welcomed at their hearths? Sarah stood in the center of the elders' meeting place, her gentle voice carrying unexpected strength. "She belongs among us," the herbalist insisted, clutching her basket of healing roots. "A child grows within her, one of our own. Would you deny warmth to a mother in winter?" Derek's weathered face hardened. "Traditions exist for reasons beyond your understanding," he countered, his authority filling the room. "Her presence would mock what we hold sacred." The villagers shifted uncomfortably, torn between compassion and custom. Some nodded at Sarah's words, while others averted their eyes, unwilling to challenge the elder. Torvin, seeing opportunity, stepped forward with calculated concern. "The blacksmith only wants what's best for all," he said, his voice smooth as polished metal. "Perhaps it's kinder to maintain our ways than to pretend nothing has changed." As darkness fell and most retreated to their homes, Sarah made her way to Bram's mountain lodge, carrying bread and dried berries, her silent protest against exclusion. The cabin glowed with modest warmth, Alina resting by the fire while Bram stared into the flames. Later, when Alina had fallen asleep, Bram motioned Sarah outside. They stood beneath a sky scattered with winter stars, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "My sister," he began, his voice rough with disuse, "was carrying a child when I was barely a man." He paused, jaw working against memories. The village elders, not unlike Derek, gave her until sunrise to leave. Sarah's eyes widened. "You never told anyone." "I said nothing then," Bram continued, his shoulders heavy with the weight of confession. "I watched her walk away in winter, just like this one." His calloused hand gestured toward the dark forest. "She never survived the season." Understanding bloomed across Sarah's face. "So when you claimed Alina's child—" "I couldn't fail twice," he whispered. "Not when I could stand between her and the same fate." The herbalist reached out, briefly touching his arm, the first human contact he'd accepted in years. "Your sister would be proud," she said softly. Bram's eyes reflected starlight and old pain. "Perhaps, but it's not enough to protect one woman when the custom remains. His village must change." Sarah nodded, knowing his words carried the weight of prophecy. The hearth ritual continued in the village below, but here on the mountain, a different kind of warmth was kindling, one that might eventually thaw even the coldest traditions. The thunderous crack echoed through the valley as the main bridge collapsed into the swollen river. Villagers watched in horror as their lifeline to the outside world disappeared beneath the churning waters. 3 days of relentless autumn rain had weakened the ancient wooden structure beyond repair, and now Ember Glen faced the grim reality: isolation with rapidly dwindling supplies. "We have enough grain for 2 weeks, at most," Derek announced grimly at the emergency gathering. The elder's weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes darted accusingly toward Bram Calder and Alina, as if their presence had somehow invited this disaster. Torvin stepped forward, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his waist. "We could rebuild, but it would take a month with this weather," he declared, glancing at the leaden sky. Murmurs of desperation rippled through the crowd. From the back of the gathering, Bram cleared his throat. The mountain man rarely spoke in public, and heads turned in surprise. "There's another way across," he said, his voice low but carrying. "A hidden ford, half a day's walk upstream." Silence fell. Sarah, standing near the herbalist's workspace with bundles of dried plants in her arms, nodded encouragingly at him. "And you've kept this secret all these years?" Torvin challenged, his voice sharp with suspicion. "While we struggled with supplies every winter?" Bram's jaw tightened. "It's dangerous in high water, only safe to cross a few months each year." "Convenient timing," the blacksmith muttered, loud enough for all to hear. Old Wina stepped forward, her gnarled fingers clutching her walking stick. "The mountain has always kept its secrets," she intoned. "Perhaps it reveals them only when needed." The next morning, Bram led a small party upstream. The rain had finally stopped, but the path was treacherous with mud and fallen branches. When they reached the ford, several villagers gasped at the width of the river. "The stones create a natural crossing," Bram explained, pointing to barely visible rocks beneath the rushing water. "But the current is strong." When Marta, the baker's elderly mother, stumbled at the edge, Bram made his decision. Without a word, he lifted the frail woman into his arms and waded into the frigid water. The current pushed against his legs, but he moved with the certainty of someone who had made this crossing countless times before. One by one, he carried the weakest across, the elderly, the children, those too afraid to trust their footing. The metallic scent of wet earth filled his nostrils as water soaked through his clothes. By sunset, everyone had crossed safely, supplies secured. As they trudged back toward the village, Sarah fell into step beside him. "They'll remember this," she said quietly. Bram said nothing, but noticed the changed looks from the villagers. Where fear and suspicion had lived, something new flickered, something that felt uncomfortably like respect. The raven appeared on the third day of the deep freeze, its obsidian feathers stark against the snow-laden roof of Bram Calder's mountain lodge. For 7 days it remained, unmoved by wind or hunger, its glassy eyes fixed on the smoke curling from the chimney below. "A spirit messenger," old Wina declared, when she trudged through knee-deep snow to witness the bird herself. The village storyteller's weathered face crinkled with significance as she pointed her gnarled finger skyward. "The raven chooses Bram as guardian. This child's fate is sealed by powers beyond our understanding." Word spread quickly through Ember Glen. Villagers braved the bitter cold to glimpse the omen, clustering at the edge of Bram's property, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Some left small offerings, bundles of dried herbs, carved tokens, at the base of a nearby pine. "Nonsense," Derek muttered during the elders' gathering that evening. The rigid village leader pounded his walking stick against the packed earth floor. "We cannot allow superstition to override our traditions. The bird is merely seeking shelter from the storm." Torvin seized upon the elder's skepticism. "Perhaps our mountain man arranged this sign himself," the blacksmith suggested, his ambitious eyes gleaming in the firelight. "A clever trick to cement his claim on the child." But doubt had already taken root. Half the village now viewed the raven as blessing, the other half as portent of misfortune. Children whispered that Bram could speak to forest creatures. Women debated whether the child would be born with special gifts or terrible curses. Inside the lodge, Alina watched the raven through frost-edged windows. "Do you believe what they're saying?" she asked, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Bram shook his head, stoking the fire with practiced movements. The mountain man had never put stock in legends, preferring the certainty of survival skills to the vagaries of prophecy. Yet even he could not deny the bird's unnatural persistence. "I claimed your child because it was right," he said finally, his gravelly voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "Not because of birds or omens." Sarah arrived that evening with fresh remedies, her gentle presence a balm against growing tensions. The herbalist studied the raven with thoughtful eyes before turning to Bram. "Whether you believe or not, others do," she warned. "This sign will either shield you or make you a target." That night, as wind howled through the valley, Bram stood alone on his porch. staring up at the silent bird. He felt the weight of expectation settling across his shoulders like a heavy cloak, one woven from threads of prophecy, judgment, and hope. The burden of protection he had chosen was transforming into something far more complex, something that might reshape not just 3 lives, but the very fabric of Ember Glen itself. The raven watched, unblinking, as if waiting for him to accept what he had always denied, that some choices echo far beyond intention, becoming legend, whether we will them to or not. The winter had yielded to early spring, but Alina's discomfort only grew as her body swelled with child. Each morning, Sarah would trek up the mountain path, her basket filled with fresh herbs and tinctures. Today, as the herbalist ground dried leaves into powder at Bram's table, Alina watched her methodical movements with curiosity. "These are mountain feverfew," Sarah explained, noticing Alina's interest. "Excellent for easing the aches that come with carrying a child." She worked with practiced hands, measuring precise amounts into small cloth pouches. "Where do you find such rare herbs this time of year?" Alina asked, rubbing her lower back. Sarah paused, her eyes flickering toward the doorway where Bram had just stepped out. "I don't find them," she admitted quietly. "Bram provides them, has been for years." Alina's brow furrowed in confusion. "But how? The village barely sees him." "That's by design," the herbalist replied, leaning closer. "Every spring and summer, he gathers herbs from places on the mountain only he knows. Before dawn, he leaves bundles outside my door. Feverfew, wild sage, birthroot, healing moss, plants that have saved countless mothers and babies in Ember Glen." Alina sat stunned, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Even while they shunned him?" "Even then," Sarah nodded. "When Marta's twins came early last winter, it was Bram's frost lichen that stopped her bleeding. When old Wina's granddaughter struggled to birth her son, his blue mountain root eased her pain. She tied off a small pouch. He never wanted recognition, just couldn't bear to see suffering he could prevent." That evening, as Bram returned with firewood, Alina watched him through new eyes. His movements were deliberate, his face weathered by years of solitude, yet there was gentleness in how he stacked the logs, careful not to disturb her rest. "Sarah told me about the herbs," she said finally, "about how you've been helping the village all along." He froze momentarily, then continued his work without looking up. "People need help sometimes. Doesn't matter what they think of me." The news spread quickly through Ember Glen. Women who had once crossed the road to avoid Bram began to nod in acknowledgement. Children no longer ran from his shadow. Even Derek seemed less certain in his condemnations. One afternoon, as spring rain pattered against the roof, Alina found Bram sorting seeds near the window. "Why didn't you ever tell them?" she asked. "Words don't matter much," he replied. "Actions do." Alina placed her hand over his calloused one. For the first time, she didn't feel like a burden he had nobly shouldered, but part of something genuine, something chosen. The mountain man had been protecting the village long before he stood up for her, his compassion as steady and quiet as the mountain itself. The failed planting had left Ember Glen on edge. Fields that should have been bursting with green shoots remained barren, and the specter of hunger loomed over the village. Torvin saw opportunity in this desperation. The blacksmith had been waiting patiently, stoking the embers of discontent just as skillfully as he tended his forge. "Strange, isn't it?" Torvin remarked loudly one evening as villagers gathered around the communal well. "How our troubles began when Bram Calder inserted himself into our affairs." His words fell like hammer blows on hot metal, deliberate and precise. "And now this raven business, convenient omens appearing just when he needs them." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in agreement while others cast their eyes downward, unwilling to engage. Torvin pressed his advantage, moving through the square with the confidence of a man who believed himself righteous. "The mountain man claims to protect Alina, but has anyone questioned why?" he continued. Our traditions kept Ember Glen safe for generations. Now our crops fail while he plays at prophecy. By nightfall, his whispers had spread through the village like wildfire. The blacksmith visited Derek's home under cover of darkness, the orange glow from the elder's hearth illuminating their conspiratorial meeting. "The solstice approaches," Torvin urged, leaning toward the rigid village elder. "If we don't act before then, the child will be born and will never restore proper order." Derek stroked his gray beard, his weathered face a mask of concern. "The village is already divided. Some believe the raven truly was an omen." "Superstition," Torvin scoffed. "Old Wina sees spirits in every shadow. We need decisive leadership, not stories." The next day, families began choosing sides. Those who had benefited from Bram's knowledge of the mountain paths or received his secretly provided herbs stood firm in their support. Others, fearful of change and drawn to Torvin's confident promises, demanded action against Alina. Sarah watched this division with growing alarm. The gentle herbalist had seen how Bram's quiet generosity had sustained the village through difficult times, even when they shunned him. Now, as she prepared remedies in her small workspace, she overheard two women arguing about Alina's fate. "This isn't about tradition," she finally interrupted, her voice soft but steady. "This is about fear and power." The women fell silent, surprised by the healer's directness. In his mountain lodge, Bram remained unaware of how precariously balanced his and Alina's future had become. He continued preparing for the child's arrival, carving small wooden figures, just as his sister once had, while Torvin's influence spread through the valley like a slow poison, dividing neighbor from neighbor, friend from friend. The morning light filtered through the small window of Bram's lodge, casting golden patterns across the wooden floor. Alina sat beside the cradle they had unearthed weeks ago, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings that adorned its edges. Something about them had been nagging at her memory, a familiarity she couldn't quite place until now. "These patterns," she whispered, reaching for the small wooden charms she'd found among Bram Calder's possessions. Placing them side by side with the cradle's edge, she gasped. The swirling designs matched perfectly. The same hand had created both. Bram entered silently, freezing when he saw what she was doing. "Your sister made these, didn't she?" Alina asked, her voice gentle but firm. The mountain man's weathered face tightened, but he nodded once, the gesture heavy with unspoken grief. "She was skilled with a carving knife," he finally said, settling beside her on the rough-hewn bench. "Made charms for every child born in the valley before they sent her away." Outside, the spring breeze carried the scent of new growth as Alina pieced together the truth. "You've kept her memory alive all this time, hidden away up here." Later that afternoon, Old Wina arrived with herbs from Sarah. The storyteller's eyes immediately fixed on the cradle and charms laid out on the table. "The sister's work," she murmured, not a question, but a recognition. Her gnarled fingers hovered over the carvings. Protection symbols, ancient ones. Word spread quickly through Ember Glen. By evening, villagers gathered in small clusters, their conversations hushed but animated. The revelation that Bram had preserved his banished sister's legacy, not just her memory, but her craft and care, rippled through the community. "He's been guarding her traditions all along," Sarah explained to a group near the village square. The herbalist's words carried weight. She had witnessed Bram's quiet compassion firsthand. Those same remedies he provides for births, they were his sister's recipes. Even Derek, rigid in his adherence to village law, found himself troubled by this new understanding. The elder stood at the edge of the gathering, listening as opinions shifted like wind through summer grass. "Perhaps," ventured one of the older women who had once supported Alina's banishment, "we've misunderstood his intentions. He honors both our ways and mercy." Torvin alone remained unmoved, his ambition burning too bright for sympathy. But the blacksmith found fewer ears willing to hear his whispers of dissent. As twilight deepened over the valley, Alina sat by the cradle once more, understanding finally what Bram had done. He hadn't merely claimed her child out of defiance or pity. He had recognized in her the same vulnerability his sister had faced, and offered what he couldn't give before: protection, belonging, and a chance to remain part of the circle that had once cast out those it should have embraced. The sky darkened to an ominous purple as the summer solstice approached. Lightning forked across the heavens, illuminating Emberglen in harsh, momentary flashes. Inside Bram's mountain lodge, Alina clutched her swollen belly, a gasp escaping her lips as the first contraction seized her. "It's time," she whispered, eyes wide with both wonder and fear. Bram Calder paced nervously by the window, watching the storm intensify. The wind howled through the trees, bending them like blades of grass. When Alina's cry pierced the air, he turned sharply, his weathered face tightening with concern. "I'll fetch Sarah," he said, already reaching for his heavy cloak. The mountain man braved the punishing elements, rain lashing his face as he descended the slippery path toward the village. The herbalist was already preparing her basket when he arrived, having sensed the moment had come. "The baby chooses a dramatic entrance," Sarah remarked, gathering her remedies with practiced hands, "just like its protector." They struggled back up the mountain path, leaning into the wind that seemed determined to push them away. By the time they returned, Alina's labor had intensified. Her face glistened with sweat, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the bed. Word spread quickly through Ember Glen. Despite the tempest, villagers began appearing at the lodge door, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Old Wyna arrived, muttering about omens and blessings. Even Derek stood at the threshold, his rigid demeanor softened by the gravity of new life. Inside, Bram worked with unexpected tenderness. He crushed mountain herbs between calloused fingers, preparing the remedies his sister had once taught him. The scent of pine and wildflowers filled the room, competing with the metallic tang of the storm. "Breathe through it," he instructed Alina, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard, like the wind through the valley pines. Sarah moved efficiently between boiling water and Alina's bedside, her experienced hands guiding the process. When complications arose, the baby turned awkwardly, Alina's strength waning. The herbalist exchanged worried glances with Bram. "The mountain remedy," he said firmly, reaching for a small pouch of rare herbs kept for emergencies. Outside, the villagers huddled beneath the lodge's overhang, their previous judgments temporarily suspended by the universal anxiety of childbirth. Torvin stood apart, his ambitions momentarily forgotten as thunder cracked overhead. Hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. When Alina's final push brought her child into the world, the storm reached its crescendo, as if nature itself celebrated the arrival. Bram's hands, steady despite his fear, received the tiny life, while Sarah worked quickly to ensure both mother and child were safe. "A girl," Bram announced, his voice breaking slightly as he placed the infant in Alina's arms. As the newborn's first cry filled the lodge, a collective sigh of relief passed through the gathered villagers. The storm continued to rage outside, but within those wooden walls, the warmth of new life created a sanctuary none could deny. The night stretched endless as Alina's newborn fought for each breath. Tiny lungs struggled against the storm that had accompanied the child's arrival, each shallow gasp more fragile than the last. Bram Calder's weathered hands trembled as he cradled the infant, memories of another child, his sister's, flooding back with painful clarity. "I won't lose this one too," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind that rattled the lodge windows. Sarah worked methodically beside him, grinding herbs with practiced movements. The herbalist's face betrayed nothing but calm determination, though her eyes darted frequently to the infant's bluish lips. "The mountain sage," she instructed. "Mix it with the elderberry tincture, quickly." Alina watched from her bed, exhaustion etched across her face, yet unable to surrender to sleep while her child's fate hung in balance. "Will my baby live?" she asked, her voice cracking. Bram didn't answer. Instead, he dipped a cloth into the mixture Sarah had prepared and gently dabbed it against the infant's lips. Outside, villagers huddled near the lodge, their earlier judgments temporarily suspended by the universal fear of losing a child. Through the night, Bram refused rest. He drew on every remedy he'd learned in his years of solitude, knowledge gleaned from mountain healers long gone, wisdom passed down from his grandmother, techniques he'd desperately tried to save his sister's child years before. This time would be different. It had to be. "Breathe," he urged the infant, his gruff exterior cracking to reveal the gentleness beneath. "Fight." Near dawn, when hope seemed thinnest, Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder. "You've done everything possible," she whispered. "Sometimes we must accept." "No," Bram cut her off, his voice firm yet broken. "I failed once before. I won't fail again." He lifted the child to his chest, skin against skin, and began humming an ancient mountain lullaby, one his own mother had sung. The melody vibrated through his chest and into the tiny body he held. And then it happened. A strong, defiant cry pierced the pre-dawn silence. The sound carried beyond the lodge walls. Outside, old Wina raised her hands skyward. "The child lives," she announced, her voice carrying through the gathered crowd. Relief washed through the village like a physical force. Men who had questioned Bram's motives now nodded with newfound respect. Women who had shunned Alina wiped tears from their eyes. When Derek himself approached the lodge door at sunrise, even the elder's rigid demeanor had softened. "The mountain man has saved one of our own," he acknowledged. Alina reached for her child, tears streaming freely. "Thank you," she whispered to Bram. He simply nodded, emotion choking his words. In saving this child, he had found redemption for his past failure. And in witnessing his devotion, Ember Glen had found something too, the recognition that this outsider, this silent mountain man, belonged among them after all. The midsummer sun cast long shadows across Ember Glen Square as villagers gathered for the naming ceremony. Tradition hung heavy in the air, as it had for generations. Only the village elders could bestow a name upon a newborn, sealing their place within the community. Derek stood at the center, his weathered face solemn as he prepared to fulfill his duty as elder. Alina approached with her infant cradled against her chest, her steps hesitant yet determined. The whispers that had followed her for months had softened, but uncertainty still lingered in the gazes that followed her path. She wore flowers in her hair, a mother's crown, though none had expected her to claim this tradition. "Bring forth the child," Derek announced, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. The rigid elder extended his hands, waiting for Alina to surrender her baby for the sacred ritual. Before she could step forward, Bram Calder emerged from the crowd. The mountain man moved with quiet purpose, his presence causing a ripple of murmurs. He stood beside Alina, his shoulder nearly touching hers, a silent declaration of unity that made Torvin scowl from his position among the onlookers. "The naming belongs to the elders," Derek stated firmly, his gaze hardening as he faced Bram's challenge. "I stand before you not to take what isn't mine," Bram replied, his gravelly voice steady despite rarely addressing the village as a whole, "but to speak a truth that is." Old Wina nodded from her place near the ceremonial fire, her eyes bright with anticipation. The storyteller had been watching the raven omens for weeks, predicting this moment when tradition would bend without breaking. "This child," Bram continued, placing his calloused hand gently on the bundle in Alina's arms, "is mine not by blood, but by choice, by courage, by the bond of shared fate." Sarah stepped forward, the herbalist's presence lending weight to his words. "He has earned the right," she said softly, her gentle voice somehow carrying to every ear. Bram looked directly at Derek, I claim this child as my own, not to defy our ways, but to honor their deepest meaning. Family is more than blood. It is what we choose to protect and cherish. As if responding to his declaration, the clouds parted overhead. Golden light flooded the square, bathing the three figures at its center. Alina's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at the man who had risked everything to stand beside her. Derek hesitated, then slowly nodded. "The child shall be named by both elder and guardian," he conceded, his voice betraying a reluctant respect. Together, they spoke the name that would begin a new chapter for Ember Glen, one where tradition and compassion could exist side by side, like the mountain and the valley that had always sheltered them both. The summer solstice festival had come full circle. A year ago, on this very ground, Alina had stood alone, shamed and abandoned. Now she stood tall beside Bram Calder, her child swaddled against her chest, as the villagers gathered around the central bonfire. The flames leapt high into the darkening sky, casting long shadows across faces that no longer turned away in judgment, but watched with quiet anticipation. The square was adorned with the same garlands and torches as every year before, yet everything had changed. Sarah stood nearby, her gentle eyes reflecting the firelight, a small smile playing at her lips. Even Derek, rigid as ever, had taken his place among the elders, though the stiffness in his posture betrayed his lingering discomfort. Old Wina nodded knowingly from her place of honor, the storyteller's intuition having foreseen this moment long before others could imagine it. Only Torvin lingered at the edges, his ambitions having withered as the seasons turned and the village witnessed Bram's quiet strength and unwavering commitment. When the moment came for speeches, a hush fell over the gathering. Bram stepped forward, his large frame illuminated by the dancing flames. The mountain man who had lived so long in solitude now commanded the attention of every soul in Ember Glen. His hands, calloused from years of self-reliance, trembled slightly as he reached back to take Alina's hand. "A year ago," he began, his gravelly voice carrying across the square, "I spoke words that changed everything." He paused, swallowing hard. "Today, I speak new words that I hope will change even more." The baby cooed softly against Alina's chest, and she placed a reassuring hand on Bram's arm. "From this day forward," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "no child in Ember Glen will ever be branded unwanted. No mother will face shame alone. No father will be judged for choosing compassion over custom." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The traditions that protect us should never become the chains that bind us," Bram declared. "What matters is not the circumstances of birth, but the courage to love and protect those who need us most." As he spoke, Alina stepped forward to stand beside him, their shoulders touching. The firelight caught the wooden charm hanging at her throat, identical to those once carved by Bram's sister, identical to the patterns on the cradle now waiting in their home. "We choose to be family," she added, her voice clear and unwavering, "just as Ember Glen chooses today to be a place of welcome rather than judgment." Around the square, heads nodded. Even Derek, after a long moment, gave a reluctant nod of acceptance. The chains of tradition, forged in fear and maintained through generations, began to crack and fall away, replaced by something stronger: choice, compassion, and the courage to change. The villagers gathered under the midsummer sun, their faces turned toward Bram and Alina as they stood together on the raised platform, where just 1 year before, everything had changed. The baby, nestled in Alina's arms, cooed softly as sunlight dappled through the leaves above. What had begun as scandal had transformed into something none could have predicted, a new beginning for all of Ember Glen. Bram Calder, Once the silent figure who rarely ventured from his mountain lodge, now stood tall before the community. The mountain man's weathered face had softened over the seasons, his eyes no longer carrying the haunted look that had defined him for so long. He placed a protective hand on Alina's shoulder, the gesture speaking volumes about their journey together. "We stand before you not as outsiders seeking acceptance," Bram announced, his voice carrying across the hushed square, "but as the first of many who will choose family through bonds stronger than blood." Alina smiled up at him, radiant in her newfound confidence. She had weathered judgment and isolation, emerging stronger for it. The young woman who had once faced shame now held her head high, her child a testament to resilience rather than disgrace. Sarah moved through the crowd, offering sprigs of blessing herbs to each family. The herbalist's gentle wisdom had been instrumental in bridging divides, her remedies healing more than just physical ailments throughout the difficult year. Even Derek, standing at the edge of the gathering, gave a reluctant nod. The elders' rigid adherence to tradition had gradually yielded to something more nuanced, recognition that some customs deserved questioning. Though he would never admit it aloud, his eyes revealed a grudging respect for what Bram and Alina had accomplished. Old Wyna's voice rose in a traditional blessing, but with words altered to embrace new beginnings. "The raven brought change," she declared, "and we are wiser for heeding its call." The storyteller's tales now included Bram's courage and Alina's strength, ensuring their legacy would endure. Torvin was notably absent. The blacksmith's forge stood cold, his ambitions having withered as the village embraced compassion over judgment. Some said he had traveled to distant valleys, seeking somewhere his manipulations might find fertile ground. Children played around the central fire, unburdened by the weight of rigid traditions that had once threatened to crush spirits like Alina's. Mothers and fathers watched with lighter hearts, knowing their community now offered protection rather than punishment. As twilight approached, Bram took the child from Alina's arms and held the infant toward the setting sun. "May you grow in a valley where belonging comes from love, not decree," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "May you never know the chains we have broken for you." The villagers of Ember Glen raised their cups in unison, toasting not just to Bram and Alina, but to their own transformation, a community reborn through courage, compassion, and the quiet strength of those once cast aside.